Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. I welcome you all to the University Distinguished Lecturer Series on the behalf of Ishri School of Liberal Arts and on the behalf of Department of Literature and Languages. We have with us today Professor Thomas Fancy. Before I begin the session, I would like to invite Vice Chancellor Professor Mananch Kirandu on the dais. And let me invite Professor Sanjay Thapa, Dean Research, Dr. Blom Kumar, Registrar, Professor Poundsme. Thank you so much. We'll start with our welcome address with Professor Manoj Kiran. Address the audience.
Professor Hansen, my colleagues and students, as you all know that this University Distinguished Lecture Series we have been conducting for many years, in fact, ever since the inception of the university, where we invite eminent personalities from around the globe who come to our campus, interact with our faculty, students. In the past, there have been many eminent personalities who have come to our campus and interacted with our faculty and students. There has been a lot of learning, and that is our motto. If you see our university vision, which clearly states that we are a university that will provide unique learning experience to our students. You all know that we focus only on learning in whatever manner. And this distinguished lecture series is also a part of that learning. If you look at our curricula now, everything has been integrated seamlessly, wherein students not only can learn, but earn credits as well. So everything has been integrated very seamlessly. You all know that we are a young university. We will remain young forever. But age-wise, if we say, we will be completing 7 years of our existence in the month of July 2024. And because of you all, and when I say you all, majorly I'm talking of faculty, students, and our staff and the community. We have indeed excelled in all areas, be it research, be it innovation, be it collaborations, be it graduate outcomes. Everywhere I see that we have made our mark. So much so that people have started knowing us as SRM University-AP, not SRM University Chennai. And that is what is very important. Professor Hansen, we have come out with our second strategic, 5-year strategic plan only recently. And we all are working towards the goals and targets which we have set for ourselves. Some of the goals are lofty, but we have taken those as challenge, and we are sure and we are all committed to achieve those goals and targets. I'm very happy that you could accept our invitation to visit this lovely and vibrant campus and interact with our faculty and students. As far as Easwari School of Liberal Arts is concerned, it's new. We are taking baby steps. We have created several new departments also ever since Professor Vishnupad has joined us. And we believe that future belongs to liberal arts. Although we have been talking about it since ages, but whether you talk of engineering, sciences, business, management, all need liberal arts in one way or the other. We are going gaga about it now, but it has been there traditionally all the time. We are, I mean, creating new names, new acquiring new names, all these things are happening, but it is already there. When we design a ship or an aircraft, right? We biomimic, we do so many things which we learn from liberal arts. So therefore, it is high time that all of us should get involved in interdisciplinary research as much as we can. Not only interdisciplinary research, but interdisciplinary learning. This interdisciplinarity has to go into the classrooms where students should be doing projects which are only interdisciplinary in nature. Till then, we will remain as a very, very conventional, traditional university. It's not going to help us. Therefore, I hope that in today's lecture, which is on a very apt topic, interiority design, liberal arts education in India, there will be a lot of learning, not only for you, but to me as well. So I'm going to attend the whole lecture here. So let's welcome Professor Hansen again with an applause. And I hope you will have a wonderful stay here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Manoj K. Arora. Let me introduce Professor Thomas Hansen today. Uh, it has been a pleasure to introduce him. Many of you know and have read Professor Hansen's works already. Professor Hansen is heading the Department of Anthropology, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Stanford University, USA. He is the Reliance-Dhirubhai Ambani Professor in South Asian Studies. After his tenure at Yale University from 2004 to 2006, he has held various positions, including the Dean and the Director of Humanities and Social Sciences at University of Amsterdam. He also founded and directed Stanford's Center for South Asia from 2010 to 2017. In his works, he has engaged extensively and theoretically with the ideas of democracy and Hindu nationalism in India. Many of his earlier research was done in Mumbai during the 1990s. The conflictual times of clashes between the Muslim and Hindu nationalists, which is published with Princeton University Press in two books, The Saffron Wave, Democracy and Hindu Nationalism in Modern India, Wages of Violence, Naming and Identity in Post-Colonial Bombay. He has theoretically engaged with the issues of sovereignty, violence, politics, and religious identities in ways that speaks powerfully to the interests of many in this realm today. Another of his seminal work, which is published in 2021, is The Law of Force, The Violent Heart of Indian Politics. In an interesting debate, Dean Vishnupad and Professor Hansen, they have written and responded to each other's views on Indian politics, which you may find on the pages of Society of Cultural Anthropology. Today, Professor Hansen is going to speak about the rise of the liberal arts model of education in India and its negotiation with the prevalent hierarchies in the Indian social system. He'll speak for approximately an hour, followed by a session with the audience, responses from the audience.
So, dear colleagues, dear Vice Chancellor, dear students, thank you very much for this lovely invitation to visit your new campus. I came about an hour ago. I'm very impressed with the, the hardware I can see and all the plans for expansion. It's quite impressive. Says a lot about the will to build new institutions in India and also rethink many ways in which higher education has been thought about. And so I'm going to talk to you today about liberal art in India, but I'm actually beginning the first half or so of my talk is sort of tracing of the origins of where does this come from? What is this model actually about? And I think you might find things of interest because we imported, or the way it's being imported into India today is, of course, mainly via its popularity in North America, but actually its roots are in the post-Enlightenment context in Europe. So I'll begin with that, and then come to India a little bit later. But let me begin with the term liberal itself, which means a great many different things in different parts of the world. In the US, for example, it's today clearly associated with a socially progressive attitude, broadly identified with the political left of center. For me, a college administrator and professors such as myself across the US, I knew it was a little too early. Anyway, we face questions from parents, for instance, typically more conservative, Republican-leaning parents who would ask, so what does this liberal arts actually mean? And we have to explain, no, it doesn't mean, because their suspicion is that it means some kind of indoctrination in left-of-center values, but it actually means that we teach the students how to think for themselves and how to conduct free and critical inquiry. Now, when I say free and critical inquiry to some of these parents, it doesn't necessarily satisfy everybody because for many of them, like maybe the idea of autonomy, let alone the capacity for independent critique, also seem to have some potential of changing their children and jeopardize maybe their adherence to more traditional values, to religion, to parental authority. And I know that that situation is not completely different in India. And I know colleagues teaching in liberal arts programs across the Gulf countries, for instance, in Pakistan and so on, that report the same thing, that they encounter very similar reactions, a slight skepticism, what is this going to do? Why this model? What is it doing? Now, the question I want to begin with is, of course, are these skeptical parents completely wrong? I would say yes, they're wrong about the part about indoctrination, because that's not what we are doing. But they're not wrong about that liberal arts education is all about fostering free and critical inquiry and cultivating an autonomous self. In fact, the entire thinking behind what became liberal arts education in the 19th century and later much more in the 20th century was decidedly anti-clerical, that's anti-church, anti-hierarchical, and anti-aristocratic, and largely secular, as in being devoted to expanding the minds of students in topics that were considered free, that is not bound by religious dogma, like theology, or legal dogma, like in law and traditional jurisprudence. or what was at the time known as Church Latin, that is the Latin you had to learn in order to study the text, the canonical text in Christianity. Those were the dominant topics in higher learning in Europe until the 18th century. So instead, these three topics were considered to be all kinds of scientific inquiry into the laws of nature, the nature of aesthetics, philosophy, language, but also new disciplines at the time, such as history, the study of non-Christian antiquity, and later archaeology. And the spirit behind it was in many ways summed up by Immanuel Kant, and here we have our first slide. The great 18th century philosopher who advocated for the liberation of what he saw as the innate power of reason and judgment in the fields of morality, politics, and aesthetics. And one of his very few pieces written for a broader audience, Kant began his essay with a newspaper article called What is Enlightenment in 1784. And he says, enlightenment is man's emergence from the self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. You can't believe that every human being has the capacity for independent thinking and independent reasoning, which was quite a revolutionary idea at the time. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in the lack of understanding, but in the lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude, which in Latin means have courage or dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of enlightenment. It pretty much sums up in a very succinct way what some of the thinking that actually went into this new type of education. I'll come to this in a moment. But Kant's project was actually, he's ended his life. He wrote about cosmopolitanism and perpetual peace and so on. Some of you may be familiar with this, because he concluded, he sincerely believed, and many people have pointed out that he was probably wrong in his optimism, that such a liberation of reason would transform society and the relationship between rulers and the ruled. So he would say that further in this essay on enlightenment, he would say, once nature has removed the hard shell from this kernel for which she has most fondly cared, namely the inclination to free and vocation for free thinking, the kernel gradually reacts on a people's mentality whereby they become increasingly able to act freely. And he continues, right, and he says that it influences the principles of government, which finds it can profit by treating men who are now more than machines in accord with their dignity. But with this also goes this idea that in order to act with dignity and be recognized as an individual with dignity, you have to have certain knowledge, you have to have certain education, which some of his students, as we'll see in a moment, develop much further. Elsewhere, of course, Kant also argued that as humans withdraw from reliance on religious dogma, they have to trust their own judgment. This cannot be done merely by reliance on one's own self-interest, but one must find a foundation outside and above it, in some form of common good and in universal principles. In his writings on moral philosophy, he elaborates what he calls famously the categorical imperative that posits that true moral judgments must treat humans as ends in themselves and must respond not just to personal preferences or personal interest, but to a greater good, a greater universality, that is a broader community or society. He also similarly says that true aesthetic judgment, what is beautiful, what is not beautiful, and praiseworthy, must be more than personal preference like I like or I don't like, I hate, and instead ground itself in what he called a disinterested attitude on a more universally applicable principle of symmetry, color schemes, intellectual content, and much else. Now, it was two of Kant's students who went on to exercise an enormous influence on how we think about education across the world today. And I talk briefly about both of them. On the one hand, a few years after Kant, we have this fellow, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who is mostly known for his work on, he was a philosopher, idealist philosopher, but he was also known for his work as he's seen as one of the founding fathers of modern German nationalism. In fact, his text, Addresses to the German Nations, written in 1808, it was a call to Germans to wake up and rekindle the national spirit they had within it. And it was actually 100 years later, during World War I, was reprinted in pocket form and distributed to all German soldiers serving in the trenches of World War I as a form of encouragement for them to commit themselves to the nation. His argument, and this connection between education and nation, is really important because it basically drives everything that comes after. He argues that this was after German troops, the Prussian state had been defeated by Napoleon, but Germany had to mobilize its inner strength as a nation. The problem was, Fichte argued, that the nation and its spirit had fallen prey to division, to excessive pursuit of wealth and status, and the nation, he argued, was merely at that time a latent fact, but dormant in a shared language and in shared popular culture, but had not yet been awakened to self-consciousness. The answer to that, Fichte argued, was to create general comprehensive schooling of all citizens so as to ensure that they were all exposed to the same instruction in history, language, and aesthetics. Again, a completely revolutionary idea. I mean, there had been comprehensive schooling to some extent in some parts of Europe, but only for a few decades at that time. So and you see this quote, I'm not going to read it out, it speaks for itself, but basically he says that only by creating comprehensive education can one build a nation, can one build what he calls a corporate body, and the national self that's capable of doing great things. Now, and it's because of finding, he believed that education could animate this kind of common interest in people. Compulsory schooling had been implemented, as I said, in some places like Prussia and my native country, Denmark, earlier than that. But its expansion was highly connected with a general national revival across Europe at the time, and the effort at producing these new national peoples across Europe. It's interesting, though, that economically advanced countries such as France, UK, and US, which had much deeper class divisions than these continental nations, only introduced compulsory education much later, as late as in the middle of the 19th century. The other major figure I just briefly mentioned was Wilhelm von Humboldt. He was a philosopher, statesman, comparative linguist, founder of the modern research university as we know it, including department chairs, disciplines, journals, colloquia, all the stuff we do in universities was basically codified and invented in the early 19th century by Humboldt and his colleagues. The Humboldt University still exists in Berlin. That model, rather than the sort of more ministerial Oxford and Cambridge model steeped in Christian tradition, became a model to follow by all the new research universities set up in the US and other parts of the world in the following 2 centuries. He was a strong advocate of universal schooling, and Humboldt focused mostly on higher learning, the idea of exposing students to new knowledges generated in active research environments rather than in stale dogma and rote learning of the past. The Humboldtian philosophy was ambitious and lofty, aiming to expand the minds of students, of building their capacity for interior reflection in the tradition of self-formation, or what in German is known as Bildung, or the formation of the self, the cultivation of the self. And inspired by his even more famous brother, who you may have heard of, Alexander von Humboldt, geographer, geologist, botanist, and many, many other things, they set up this broad program for the study of world cultures, of languages, and history. And this is what he says about there are certain kinds of knowledge, right, that must be available for people in order to also become something else than just, it's not about producing academics or teachers or researchers, but just to produce good craft workers, merchants, soldiers, businessmen, who, unless, as he says, regardless of their occupation, they're good, upstanding, and according to their condition, well-informed human beings and citizens. So my title, Interiority Design, in many ways comes from this Humboldtian idea that you have to build a broad basis, you have to expand the self, make it capacious and make it capable of reflection, self-introspection, critical thought, and proper decision based on those things. For Humboldt, the end goal was this kind of very lofty idea of world citizenship, a cosmopolitan citizenship, or the ability to dwell in the world as such, and that requires in the a certain collective bond or collective understanding which connects autonomous individuals irrespective of their social and cultural socialization. So he was at odds with Fichte on this, who believed that the nation was the proper vehicle for this. Obviously, it was Fichte who won the day and not Humboldt when it came to the ethics of the end goal of what proper education was. Now, the Humboldtian program was that higher education aimed not just for preparation for professions and vocations, but building, as I say, these reflexive selves and building citizens capable of qualified choice. This emphasis on general knowledge, broad orientation, was based on the belief that proper interiority and abstraction, capacity for abstraction, actually could only be achieved if there was a larger space of resonance and mind expanded by the knowledge, in this case, of history, Greek art, philosophy, as well as the periodic table and mathematical abstraction. And this model is what underlies virtually every liberal arts program, the idea of majors, the idea of breadth requirements, that engineers become better engineers if they also do courses in the liberal arts, and so on and so forth. It was coming up to the 1970s across much of continental Europe that the entire first year of the university education was devoted to such broad cultivation, much of which had also happened in the preparatory secondary education known as gymnasium. And this first year was known as Philosophicum. And obviously the number of students exposed to this kind of education was limited, and many came from relatively privileged backgrounds. But the entire idea was nonetheless meritocratic and deeply vested in the idea of the transformative power of knowledge and of cultivating this interior space in humans, in citizens. These ideas were informed by Fichte's ideas of inclusiveness and equality within a national community, certainly in the way they unfolded. However, as we know, the idea of a national community was not necessarily a free association of individuals, but what in Germany and then later in other nations became conceptualized as a community of fate. That is something you're bound to regardless of your own political or ethical orientation. You can't opt out of it. That was an idea that, of course, Nazis and other radical nationalists took to the extreme. But at its core, nonetheless, this conception of the modern individual and the role of modern education remained the desire to produce a new, non-aristocratic elite by cultivating the best talents that could improve the state, the sciences, and the economy. In this model, the idea of merit and talent was precisely a challenge to the permanent social hierarchies that had always accorded privilege to those at the top. Now, the relationship between educational systems and citizenship is a very interesting one, and I'm happy to take questions about this. It's not a straightforward story, but there are connections in very many ways. How educational systems got rolled out and how that translated into political rights, for instance, is a complicated one. But suffice it to say that with this Humboldtian program, higher education had firmly shifted from the cultivation of virtue as in the classical and aristocratic tradition among elite men to an exercise of building character, which became the operative word in much of that time, among much larger numbers of men and later women, a system that, as I said, was by and large intact until World War II. But before I move on to talk about the sort of real move and the push that created liberal arts on a different scale in the 20th century, especially after World War II, let me just talk about that residual question that was never fully addressed by the Humboldtian. There we go. No need. All right. and that question, which was never properly addressed, and which actually, and I'm going to talk about this for quite a while, and also return to it in Indian context, the question and remains a bone of contention, the place of classics and other elements of what in the early 20th century became known as civilizational values and cultivating a national culture. So, oh, yeah, you can look at this. This is the former president of Yale, who was talking in a famous report from 1828, who was sort of consciously at that time moving from one system to embrace this kind of Humboldtian ethics. But the emergence of German university system of broad education also clashed with the older Oxbridge, you might say, model, and older clerical model rooted in classics and theology and jurisprudence, and so on. And that was a model that was copied on the American East Coast. So Harvard, Yale, Princeton, many of the Ivy League institutions were actually modeled on this college system, and where Christianity were held a very, very prominent place, and where theology and Christian thought was taught on a large scale. So there are two pressures emerging, and I think this is important to think about. That on one hand, you had the German system that emphasized the sort of classics, Greek and Latin, science, foundation of a national culture, civilizational ideology, and there were many secular Germans who were happy, and others who embraced the classics and completely discard Christianity. And in many German-style universities, and indeed French universities, there was an emphasis on secularity, imparting and embracing a longer Western civilizational tradition of science, and so on, and thought, beginning with the Greek. They also grew very bold. And when you look at education, it's interesting how the Anglo-Saxon world to begin with was really lagging behind, and how theologians, for instance, played a completely outsized role in British higher education well into the 20th century, especially at Oxford and Cambridge, but also other elite institutions. But in the US, for instance, there was like increased pressure to drop classics, to drop Latin, to drop some of these disciplines and move on to this sort of more free inquiry in liberal arts model. And much of the impetus for that came from a disdain for a critique of a model that was associated with British elite education and upper class values coming from Britain, especially in the early decades of the American Republic. This was something that was really important to create distance to that. When the Ivy League began to embrace cautiously this Humboldtian program, and this is what Jeremiah Day has to say about this is good. We have to embrace free thought, but it's always with the caveat that, not too much, and very cautious in his conceptualization. But it expanded, and gradually the American system became marked by free choice, by building a system which is recognizable from today, with majors and minors that became the cornerstone of liberal arts programs. But still, many universities and many of the smaller colleges, many of whom were steeped in Christianity, some of them progressive Christianity, like Oberlin College or Bryn Mawr, or others that advocated women's education early and so on. Others were quite conservative. So the vast majority of American colleges remained steeped in the Christian tradition, something that changed only in the 1960s, actually. That included also big Jesuit and Catholic school systems, university systems across the country, like Notre Dame, Georgetown, and many more. Now, there was also another factor, which was the demographic kind of challenge to this particular model. In the UK, for instance, there were very few universities, and let me just see if I can. Yeah, there were very few universities. There were University College, there was Oxbridge, and so on, and the more dynamic Scottish universities. And then there were other larger universities that were gradually opening up at the end of the 19th century, like tied to industry, supported by by members of industry like in Manchester and so on. It's sort of taking also cues from what was happening in the US at the time. But still, higher education was a very limited affair in the UK. By 1930, UK had a total of 37,000 university students enrolled, and only and very few universities, around 21. By contrast, India at the same time, in 1950, had 28 universities and as many as 174,000 students. So the Indian institutions were already much bigger than they were in the colonial time. And in Britain, there was this kind of consistent disdain from the old academic establishment for these new universities. Some of them were only allowed to be called polytechnics, which was seen with a measure of disdain. They were not properly cultured. They didn't have the cultural capital and so on. So this sort of notion of a certain ingrained hierarchy carried on much longer in Britain than in most other places. But in the US, that was not the case. And really, it was this kind of anti-aristocratic move or energy that drove the expansion and a certain egalitarian ethos of expansion that grew the American university system both in the early 20th century and especially in the 20th century. To give you a figure, but the change is quite recent. In 1960, 8% of all Americans attended university. Today, higher education, tertiary education of various kinds, today that figure is 37.5, which is still low, modest compared to other nations, so leaders of the pack like South Korea, Taiwan, and others that have well above 50%, Norway, and so on and so forth, right? And the part of the reason for that is also the American university system is admitting a very large number of students from across the world, and that's part of the economic and financial model. But we also sometimes ignore something that is of utmost, I think, relevance to what happens in India today and has happened in the last few decades, but often ignored, is that what made this immense expansion of universities and university populations possible in the US after World War II, with a great sort of lift in social mobility, was and this was a public sector decided investment that began from 1920, around 1920, until throughout most of the 20th century, investment in quality education at the level of primary and secondary education. So in 1910, for instance, only 10% of Americans attended high school. But in 1960, as many as 90% of Americans actually attended high school, about 75% got a diploma. 12 years of education, so a very high number. And that in itself actually says a lot about the investment in human capital that then made possible the expansion and the high quality of tertiary education when the secondary education was in place. Something I think that's a very burning problem in this country, that the lower tiers, the feeding lines into higher education are simply not as strong as they should be. So this was also, that time was also the heyday of what we often today call progressive education, the progressive education movement in America, when this fellow, who you may have heard of, John Dewey, who was at one point called America's preeminent philosopher. He was a very big name in the early 20th century. He was also the professor of Dr. Ambedkar at Columbia University and exercised a very seminal influence on the way Ambedkar thought about many things. Dewey was a progressive. He believed in an inclusive and egalitarian model of education that also include experience and first-hand exposure to social problems and to technical problems and skill development and so on and so forth. And he is called a pragmatist because for him, practical experience was paramount. You can't become a good scientist, you cannot become a good teacher, you cannot become a good academic or anything for that matter without having some kind of relationship to the material that surrounds you, the world that surrounds you. Dewey himself was critical of of the liberal arts as they were conceptualized at the time because of its association with an elite education. However, as the new progressive trends in education expanded in the 60s, Dewey's ideas in his book, Democracy in Education, were of the seminal importance of education and its ability to shape the mind and disposition of a child and prepare the modern individual for active and informed participation in democracy gained new ground, especially across the country's thousands of smaller colleges. And US has around 3,000 universities that are registered as universities. And this this became quite. You can see here. This is a quote from his from another book about experience in education, where he advocates for this kind of free activity, that learning has to come from some form of inner driving force and not just be imposed. The curriculum should be constantly dynamic and respond to the surrounding society, but also respond to the social world and realities in the social horizon within which students live. And this was of utmost importance in the US, which at the time was an expanding society, lots of immigrants arriving from different parts of the world, people coming to seek a new life, but also in many ways to seek a new definition of themselves, see themselves and their life on a new footing. I'll come back to this towards the end when I talk about what liberal arts the aspiration may also entail for India. So as liberal arts, but there were still other critiques of this model, and Jews was one, and there were a similar kind of progressive critique, you can say, of liberal arts, saying, well, we have to be very practical about education. We want to extend education to as many people as possible. That was also the ethos in the US. They don't all have to learn about Greek columns and the great books of the traditional learning. They have to learn to become good engineers or good craftspeople or good technicians. And that was an argument that more or less won the day. And also very much in Europe, something that coincided also with the rise of socialist and social democratic governments whose preeminent goal was to create welfare states and create a more inclusive society, as we see the results are visible in Europe today. Their critiques were based in part of the pragmatism of someone like Dewey, and his critique of what he called the hidden curriculum of social values and class hierarchies that he felt was embedded in the old Humboldtian system, right? All the hidden learning that made it better, easier for people from bourgeois families to prosper in school rather than those who came from working class backgrounds. So, but nonetheless, it sort of won the day. And many economists argue today that the industrial and technological staying power of many European countries are built precisely on the cultivation of technically skilled labor force across Europe. In the US, it was slightly different. The middle classes were attached to the liberal arts model, but there was still this kind of push for, and it's still there, for relevant knowledge, for something that has utility, that can actually be employed and can gain you a high salary, an argument that's very well known in India too, as well. And then there's the culture wars. And that's a discussion that's still going on, a kind of pressure against liberal arts and US campuses as places that foster radicalism, identity politics, and also the much maligned critical race theory and all that. A situation that's not exactly unknown in India, in the sense that the critique of that has also been here. It hasn't come to the liberal arts institutions yet, but in the US, the target is very much the liberal arts as a place that fosters an ideology of equality, of identity politics, rather than full liberty and commitment to classical values. So the response has been something called the classical education movement that teaches all the Greek classics and has introduced the great books and so on and so forth. So that's a talk of war that's going on as we speak. All right, let me give you a few slides on India and then come to some questions at the end that might stimulate some discussion here. I wanted to lay out this landscape because I think it's important to know what liberal arts actually implies and how we implement it and think about it. Well, we know from the historical record and in the decades after Humboldt's ideas of the benefits of general science-based education, right, Macaulay and other officials set out to create a system of English language higher education that would produce a new colonial elite. They were based on the British educational system, as we know, training in the sciences and other training that aimed at producing manpower for the civil service and so on and so forth. The element of training in humanities and social sciences offered here was not the broad introduction to history and the classics of Western civilization, but rather a crash course in British history and literature. In fact, what became known later as the canon of British literature was invented in the mid-19th century in colleges across South India because teachers and officials at these new colonial colleges felt the need to instruct the natives in the glories of British culture and letters as not only coherent and cohesive in their own right, but also somehow miraculously condensing the finest fruits of all of European civilization. You wouldn't be surprised to hear that. These officials also believed that Brahmins and scribal classes such as Kayas and other, and to some extent also binary communities were naturally suited to this form of training and discipline throughout the colonial period. That reflected completely in the demographic of the students enrolled, which were overwhelmingly from these rather smaller communities, something which I'm happy to talk about, and something that's also still the case and is still a live, of course, concern. But the idea here was that these communities have inherited via their blood and their environment the potential to develop a capacity for abstract thought and interior reflection, but of course, not too much during the colonial era. There was, in this system, limited as it was, a strong utilitarian, even a certain anti-intellectual ethos. Everything had to serve the building of the colonial project, impart useful and relevant knowledge, and be cost-effective. And there was also the influence of the missionaries and so on that was quite considerable, of course, and still is. After independence, many of these elements and the focus on training in various specialized and applied domains rather than the broad acquisition of knowledge and personal self-development persisted. The technical research institutes, the IITs, IIMs, and all that were expanded and we know the IITs were built by different countries that Nehru and others felt were exactly embodying this kind of devotion to the Humboldtian model of a research university with broad inquiry, but also a respect for science that they felt was lacking in the classical British model. So the emerging research system and the growing number of universities, you can see here just the immense growth of very lately, was largely, as we know, secular, focus on sciences as well as education, humanities, and social sciences. The question of, and I come to this now and meditate a bit on this and then wrap up, of classics, philosophy, religion, and teaching about what today is often called the Indian or the Indic civilization was largely left unaddressed and was not considered mandatory nor necessary. History curricula was shaped to reflect the multi-layered and multicultural history of the subcontinent, while the study of Sanskrit, Pali, archaeology were small and marginal pursuits in the larger project of post-colonial development. In fact, many scholars of Sanskrit would bemoan the fact that by 1990s, India had fewer departments of ancient Indian languages than Germany alone, which is true to this day. Training in the classics was, in this model, neither required nor deemed important. In fact, it was the mastery of English that became the all-important entry requirement. Instead, you could say that the question of the classics um, an instruction in Sanskrit, but also music, classical dance, other things that are seen as part of the Indian heritage was largely privatized, that is located within the homes and family networks and communities of upper caste families, passed on as has been the case for many generations, but now valorized as part of a cherished cultural capital and preparedness for abstract reasoning and citizenship. One can say that as caste was being privatized in modern India, by which I mean that caste practices and preferences and prejudices were cultivated within the realm of kinship and the domestic and community sphere, rather than as manifest parts of a public identity except politics, classic education became a part of what you could call a hidden curriculum that added factor and confidence that to this day make many upper caste students feel more at ease in schools and higher learning. It's not the only thing, there are many other things, but it's definitely one. So with the introduction of liberal arts in India, one has to ask oneself, what liberal arts exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about the Humboldtian system, its emphasis on history and classics, or are we talking about a version of the progressivist ideal of inclusion, relevance, building citizenship, and so on, or a combination of the two, and if so, which combination? First, if one adopts a more Humboldtian line, does one need an Indian model of Western Civ, great books and classics, Indian civilizational courses? Should the text be Hindu? In which case, what kind of Hindu are we talking about? Not an easy question once you start thinking about it for more than 5 minutes. Muslim, again, a sort of complicated question. Should everybody read Ambedkar now? Because Ambedkar seems to have become a new classic. Wasn't that 30 years ago? At Ashoka University, for instance, they have a required course in Indian civilization. It's taught in a very classical Hindu philosophy mode by the philosophers. When the anthropologists take over, they read very different content. And when the literature people take over, they read English fiction from the 19th century till today. So what is Indian civilization exactly? They keep it, but what is it? I don't know how you think about it. I would be very interested in that. I think it's a question that will not go away as long as we say liberal arts. Or should it include languages? Should they include vernacular languages? We are in the South, where there's a very strong tradition of that. It's a very strong vernacular public sphere. Tamil Nadu especially has a unique distinction in India for being a place where public debates and where very difficult works of philosophy from all over the world are promptly translated into Tamil. So the Tamil public sphere is full of very current thoughts. So would that be, should a liberal arts model be in the vernacular? And if so, how and which? Should it include great books from the Western tradition or all traditions? As in Columbia University, for instance, say, okay, we will not do Western Civ anymore, we'll do world civilization. So then people get to read a little bit of big text from India, a little bit from China, a little bit from everywhere in the world. But is that an answer to this question? Let me tell you a story, and then I'll move towards the end. I'm sort of in conversation with colleagues in Pakistan who had tried to develop a liberal arts curriculum at a school called Habib University in Karachi. There, as part of their core requirement, they have one course, which is in Islamic history and civilization. In itself, a very contentious question. Most of the people in the school are Shia persuasion, and people are, as you can imagine, the same would happen here in India. Right? There are people saying, well, this is way too Shia, it's not the real Sunni tradition, and so on. And they also have a course in Pakistani history. I know some of the people who are teaching that course, and teaching Pakistani history is very difficult because it begins in 1947, right? Or does it? How do you teach it? How do you teach the preceding 2,000 years, and so on and so forth? It's very difficult. It's difficult in any contested space where the nation and history is at stake. But let me just move towards this, towards the end. That if one elects to go with the progressivist interpretation of liberal arts in India, what it would look like? Would one include text sources, works of art that includes the diversity of experience and histories in India, including diverse caste histories, Islam, Christianity, and so on? Again, And if developing a sense of responsible citizenship, empathy, and some attunement to universal values and ethics remains an underlying purpose and rationale of liberal arts, is something like that powerful. I will say toward now also that, as we know, and I know this manifestly from conversations I had with one of the founders of Asuka University, was set up about 15 years ago, that there was a great desire among the founders and among many of the parents who sent their kids there initially, that this was a space where there wouldn't be so much politics, right? And a reaction to over-politicized campuses, but the reaction against politics was also a bit of a metaphor for caste. There was no reservation, right? So this was not only, as someone said, an American-style education at a third of the price you would otherwise have to pay, which is the economic argument, but also a kind of argument about creating spaces where merit and talent and commitment to education could not be contaminated by these identity politics phenomena. You may have heard about 2 weeks ago, there was a petition by students from liberal arts at Asuka demanding that a class census is carried out on campus, including all faculty, all students, and all staff. How that's going to end, I'm not sure, but it seems to suggest to me that there is nowhere to hide from this, and a question that probably has to be confronted head on. A final thought on on our belief in liberal arts education and its transformative now. This is a quote from Max Weber in his old classic essay, Science as Vocation, where he says that our primary task of a useful teacher is to recognize inconvenient facts. To wrestle with the relationship between fact and value is at the heart of all social science, all humanities. What is relevant, what's a relevant fact, what is a proper fact, and what is my values involved in choosing that as a relevant fact. And he says we have to constantly challenge ourselves and recognize that this is not an easily drawn boundary, but one we have to wrestle with, one we have to confront. And I want to end with this thought that are we, in some ways, maybe overestimating, perhaps sometimes, the power of liberal education. We like to believe that students come to university, to college, they learn all these things, their minds are kind of reset. So the question is, was Humboldt right? Right? That you could actually produce new people, as it were, you could produce a new kind of person, a better citizen and all that. Or are people too bound and too embedded in societal values that may be at odds with what is taught at liberal arts education? In the US, it worked beautifully, as I said, because this was a society that was already in search of its foundation, right? It's an immigrant society. Everybody came from somewhere. There was an investment in finding some form of foundation, and the idea of an equality-based, merit-based, talent-based education was really attractive. But that is not necessarily the case in other parts of the world, including India, right? Where the question of social values, for instance, are much more deeply embedded, where people are not necessarily in search of a new foundation, of a new society, right? It's a very different situation. So where does it sit? How much do we think, or do you think, and I would like to hear you hear and talk to you about this, what can liberal arts actually achieve? How far can a program like this go? How much does it carry or translate into these hallowed ideals of a new person with great values, of cosmopolitan outlooks, of great citizenship values, and so on and so forth? I'll close there. Thank you very much.
For sharing your thoughts on the issue of liberal arts, caste, and education system in India. With this, the pertinent question is the question of the vernacular as well, and the question of the university system in India as well. Is the university system in India ready to accommodate the study on vernacular? To what extent are we promoting such research through curriculum and through research as well? And I would also like you to think about the rise of humanities and social sciences departments in different IITs. What you can see is the rise of liberal arts. You can also see the rise of humanities and social sciences, the terminology and the change in the terminology, and again the rise or getting back to the notion of the liberal arts. With this, I open the session for the questions and responses. If you have any questions, please. All right, let me start with the Vice Chancellor.
Professor Hansen, um, I really liked your talk when you talked about education systems and when you talked about liberal education, when you talk about Humboldtian model or UK model, US model. I was just wondering that India, historically, if you see, right from Nalanda and Takshila, right, these university systems have been existing since ages. And these university systems, if you look at the history, they talked about knowledge, they talked about skills, they talked about experiential learning and everything at that time, thousands of years ago. So I was just wondering why there is no difference of those models into your talk. I just wanted to know from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to talk about liberal arts as we think about it today, where does it come from, and I think those traditions, you are correct, you're right that they were there. They were, I think they are, and I know, Amartya Sen has written about this also, has been involved in some form of attempt to revive some of this. I think there's one problem in it, or it's at least one. One is, like it is also the case when you think of classical education, you can say that in many people in Europe also saying, oh, but this college in Oxford goes back to the 12th century, or this place in Leiden in Holland goes back to the 14th century, whatever. And these were also universities, these were also places where people sought knowledge. But in India, ancient India, as well as in medieval and classical Europe, knowledge was not seen as a place that could necessarily transform society. It was seen as a place of producing insight into the existing order. It was also not open to most people. So Sanskrit was, of course, in India, the predominant model, as was Latin in the classical world, and Greek before that. Very few people learned this. So the numbers were incredibly small. Knowledge was restricted. Knowledge was valuable because it was restricted. So we can even think of like in a market model, if something is restricted, it's always more valuable and cherished than it's unrestricted. And it was also hidden. It was not accessible for the vast majority of people. So I think there is a limited utility of thinking about the legacy of some of these institutions. You can think about the content of some of the thought. I think one can think about the content of certain classical texts, Hindu texts, and so on, philosophical texts, treatises on morality, ethics, and so on and so forth. Absolutely. But as an institutional system, I think the demands of the hour, the demands that people have, I think we live in a Humboldtian world in a sense. We live in a world when the expectation of general education, of compulsory education, of where social aspiration across the world, much more now than even 30 years ago, is shaped by this idea of success, of climbing, of getting education. So that's why I didn't talk about it, because I wanted to focus just on the liberal arts, that story, but in itself, I think, has enough tensions to also one has to wrestle with, right? Especially the question of language, question of classics, question of history, where does it fit in? Because those are not only burning questions in the Western world, but they're also burning questions here, and they will have to be addressed at some point. I think it's very difficult to keep them off campus, as it were. Yeah. Thank you.
Competition has a question.
There's a question over here.
Welcome, Professor. I have, I think, two questions. One, because I mean the cosmopolitan self with which liberal arts education itself engage and sort of also seeks to create a cosmopolitan self. I mean, to pick what Dipesh Chakravarti argues, and that the form of rationality which one you were also talking about, and we also speak in our class, that there is an invisible West always. I mean, in that form of rationality, and how does one? I won't say disengage, but I mean problematize it in that sense, and one which is reflected even in when we are talking about that that form of rationality transforms the society, and that's why we are speaking about liberal arts. What it also creates is a modern meritocratic society, and competitive exam is a product of that. And what it does, I mean, you have also spoken about, I mean, it reproduces certain systems of caste, class, and so on and so forth. How does one engage with this question, which the Depesh is talking about, that there is an invisible West in our questions of rationality, and how do
I think that is a sort of feature of any conversation about what is knowledge in India, what is education in India, what is even, if one wants to talk about what is Indian civilization, it seems to me that anything that has been around for a long time, and Western education and Western forms of paradigms of knowledge, of scientific inquiry and so on, have been around for a very long time, to the extent that I would say without hesitation that these are properly Indian forms, right? So I'm skeptical of the idea, and I think I would disagree with Dipesh on that, that the original difference, as it were, the original civilizational difference that was maybe there 300 or 400 or more years ago, has the same form. It doesn't, right? So that's one thing that I think many of the knowledge systems and even fundamental epistemologies about what is a fact and how the procedures of truth seeking and so on and so forth that we engage every day are deeply embedded in Indian society and have been so for a long time. So to counterpose that and to say that's Western and it will always be Western, I think maybe a too static way of looking at things. And to say that things that are properly Indian might be, and this is then you go down the BJP line of who is a proper Hindu and the Hindu systems of knowledge and Vedic sciences and whatever. I mean, if you go all the way, there are enough people who make those arguments, and we'll see where that goes. So I think that's why I'm mentioning it, because it is a kind of it's a navigation that has to be performed, but I think it has to be discussed very openly. So I think Dipesh's critique maybe belongs to a sort of moment a couple of decades ago when those ideas of the colonial difference and the civilizational difference was framed in maybe a slightly different way from what it would be today, and also, I mean, it depends on who you talk to, right? So there are people who are very vested in social justice in this country, and many people who belong, whose communities come from the, let's say, Dalit communities or other very historically marginal communities for whom they will not recognize. They will say, what Hindu tradition that has done nothing good for us, right? We don't want to think about that tradition. We want to think about Buddhism maybe as a different genealogy and so on. So it's a kind of worms that has to be opened up, right? And I think, I think there's no way around it. But I will say that the designation of what is East and West and what is cultural difference and what is one civilization, another civilization is a too static a view of how things actually work. I think the technological civilization we all inhabit has in some ways lost its home address for some time, right? There are many aspects of our current technological civilization that is done better in East Asia and implemented better in East Asia than it is in, it might have come from Silicon Valley at some point or the US, but is that really the most important thing we can say about it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I mean, sorry, I'll paraphrase it. I mean, when I said that, when I was not indicating that one, sort of create this, a kind of polarities of Western, and that's why I said I mean, the question was, I was not indicating whether they create this, polarities of West and East in terms of how knowledge is produced, which is.
No, I'm talking about more about what
Yes.
let's talk about this.
Yes, yes.
Not you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, somewhere is all to the point was to also engage in a ways in which how questions of secularity and commonality or,
Yeah.
or rationality is seen and constructed, in which, like you said, that the question of Dalit won't agree. I mean, in so many ways, I mean, how one would talk about traditions,
Yeah.
but I mean, similar sense that the different epistemology Dalits would see of modernity as well as that in that context, I said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, I think for me, I mean, one can see this as a problem, and some people see it as a problem that the space of questions of cultural difference has been occupied. That was maybe a thing that was discussed in the sort of post-colonial critique of the 90s, now has been occupied by the other side of the political spectrum that has monopolized and created a certain very powerful discourse of what is properly Indian and not properly Indian, and tries to sort of monopolize a certain interpretation, and that makes it, of course, for some makes it look like a dangerous route to take. But what I'm saying is, I think some route has to be taken, because the question has to be addressed, and I think what I find very gratifying about the conversations we have in the US, and very much in response to the sort of classical education movement that wants to resurrect Christian theology and, study of Aristotle and whatever for everybody, is that I think we have been forced by our students and circumstance to develop a much broader idea of what is of relevance. How do you expand your mind? You can do that in multiple ways, and the archive or the books or the kind of seminal text you can read can be much wider than just the classical. But it's a political debate, right? But I think in a place like India, I think the archive and the possibilities are so enormous and so vast and so exciting, but of course always controversial, potentially. Yes, Vishnu.
Thanks, Thomas. I mean, how should I put it? It was absolutely incredible. I think it was a bit sketchy in the sense that you just drawing out the signposts, but I'm seeing, I'm assuming at the very least an article, if not book, project in place here.
These are all done for you guys.
Okay. I mean, I would really hope you would sort of draw many of these things out and then sort of translate it into something more substantive.
Yeah.
It'd be great to read it. I mean, I say that not least because you've drawn out so many trajectories of the liberal for the last, well, I mean, two things. One is liberal arts education on the one hand, but also the imagination of what liberal, the ways in which that imputes itself in the understanding of liberal arts education in many ways. Perhaps I have a couple of questions. One is that, so when the liberal is invoked right now, given the density of all the things that you laid out, what remains, right? So when we invoke the liberal at this point in time, what are we referring to then, right? Secondly, in some ways, the question is, we are seeing, as you also mentioned, a version of resurgence of liberal arts education, which seems to be, somewhat confused, because as you laid out in the second last slide, for instance, is that it's unclear as to what they want to invoke or what should be invoked, right? So it's a haphazard. It's opportune for us also because we are obviously trying to imagine as to what the liberal arts education should look like in SRM University and so forth. So, in that context, then is that what is your sense? I mean, I would imagine it's the latter, or perhaps a combination of both, Humboldtian as well as the the critical progressive, etc., etc. So I would want you to sort of reflect on that, flesh it out. In some ways, I would also ask, insofar as we see the resurgence, a certain desire for this object called liberal arts, it is symptomatic of what? I mean, what is it indicative of? What is it speaking to? Why that resurgence? is it speaking to a certain crisis of some kind, or a collapse of some sort?
Yeah.
Thanks.
May
Thank
I add to this question?
Yeah, yeah.
When we are talking about liberal arts, there's also within this discipline, there's a hierarchy of the disciplines as well. When we choose certain, let's say, anthropology or literature, or where is mathematical education now? So if you talk about liberal arts, so if you can talk about that as well.
Yeah,
Like if you talk about different arts, do we have mathematical education is part of the liberal arts now? I rarely find schools which include such education. So what is the hierarchy within the liberal arts as disciplines emerge?
So I'll just begin with that quickly. Well, maybe not so quickly. But so it depends on how you do it. Many institutions in the US require, we have something called breadth requirements. So you have to have a breadth of different, we have something at Stanford called 8 ways of knowing the world, right? You have to cover all 8 ways. And one of them is called formal reasoning, and maths is part of it. So there are 2 conflicts in that breadth requirement that forces the prospective computer science guys and engineers to sit through, history class or class in whatever, or many classes in that, and also those who want to do English majors, let's say, sit through a math class, which is painful for many of them because they want to study English because they don't like math, right? Is it on? Yes, it is. I think it's coming on again. But yeah, so I think there is a hierarchy, but it depends on where you look at it from, right? I mean, from the university's point of view, I think there is a hierarchy in that, of course, the sciences always bring in the big money and the big numbers and research grants, so it's very important. At the same time, I feel that I actually find that there is more commitment to liberal arts principles among my my faculty colleagues in the sciences who really tell their students you have to go and take some classes in anthropology and history and philosophy, whatever. Whereas many of our students who want to major, let's say, in history or anthropology, they're quite reluctant to go over to the science. The sort of idea of the 2 cultures, right, is still very strong. And so I think the hierarchy is a little inverse, right? Depending on from which point of view you look at it. I'm sure there would be the same here to some extent, as I've understood. So Vishnu, I mean, yeah, of course it's a sketch. I covered like a lot of ground and maybe too much ground in these slides, but yeah. So I think the question of what are the resources one would have, right, to debate this question, even debate what is the content of liberal arts. I mean, to address your question, why are we in this moment? I think we are in this moment because there is maybe sometimes a problem of translation. So what I try to provide today with the kind of this is where it comes from, and then we can discuss how has it been translated in the past, let's say 20 years to the rest of the world, as we have seen many institutions adopting the model 15 years across Asia, for instance, and also to some extent in Latin America. I think it has to do with this idea that the experience I mean, a broad fact of a hierarchy of the value of education, right? That the value of American education is in the sort of social capital of having an American institution is higher than it is to have other forms, and many parents desire to have this, and many students desire to have access to this. But I think it also speaks to a certain idea that is also a real idea of coming on campus, which is it's a sort of a fundamental part of American popular culture, that you are a young person, you grow up somewhere, you go off to college, and then you have your 4 glorious years where you do all kinds of stuff that your parents shouldn't know too much about, but you also spread your wings and you find out who you are. So that's a very powerful model. It's a very powerful promise that these 4 years, and the system kind of aids that, right? promises that kind of self-formation. And it's not necessarily that everybody has lofty Humboldtian ideas of citizenship. It's more like I want to find out what I want to do in life, and I enjoy learning about many, many different things. And we see this, and we see lots of people who had promised their parents to study engineering, and then in their third year they come over to history or to our side of things, and then they say, well, we want to major, and can you speak to my father when he comes for the next year, and so on and so forth. So, so I think that's a real thing. I mean, there's a real attraction of the liberal arts model, that it promises that kind of space of self-exploration. And that's a globally, I think, attractive idea that has been adopted. What my question is, of course, is that whether the implications of this have quite dawned on the societies in which this is unfolding. Just the way that I think it's dawned on many more conservative American households that some of these institutions actually do transform their kids into one thing to something else that they can't quite recognize, right? And they have apprehensions about it. I think that is also something that we will see maybe as the more and more institutions adopt the liberal arts model and see some of these apprehensions. They already exist to some extent, but they may be less pronounced. So again, the question of what are the resources? I think, as I said in my previous answer, that mining and going into with imagination and boldness, both into the vernacular resources in terms of, what is the vernacular, in terms of just exposing people to at least one or two. I mean, this is part of the requirement, in fact, in many liberal arts colleges in the US, that you have to do several languages. I don't know to what extent that's the case, but I think that is an incredible thing. And also being a citizen of India, that you maybe know one or two languages, not just you can talk to the chaiwala and you can take you can get around, but actually knowing something about it, knowing its literature. I think that is an irreducible value, and something that could perhaps be embraced. And maybe, I'm not saying English shouldn't remain there, but I mean, English is the big selling point of liberal arts at the moment. Right? It's always been the biggest point of higher education in India, but I think, so that's something to think with, I think.
Right. We have second part of the discussion today at 3 p.m. So those who would like to continue with the discussion, please, you can.
I have to say something completely different.
Yes. So those who want to interact with Professor Hansen on another topic, you can be at ALC 3 at 3 o'clock. I would have to end the responses right now because we are.
There was one more. You're closing it up now. I saw a hand up here in the middle there.
Okay, let's take one more response.
There was one more here. Yeah. No, sure. No. Yeah. Sorry.
Good afternoon, sir.
Thank you.
So, in this evolution of the liberal education, do you see any role of, the historicity of north of Romans, barbarians? North of Romans, like the barbarians, which they used to call, from that land to the land of Reformation. Do you see the role of that transformation in terms of understanding the historicity or evolution of liberal education?
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
the period I'm talking about is very interesting in that this is actually the time when modern history as we know it was established as a discipline with, standards of evidence and footnoting and monographs and systematic research into historical periods. And that completely upended the way in which many people understood history at the time, because as the standard narrative was exactly that, Rome was civilized and the rest were barbarians, and then there were the Middle Ages and it was a dark period, and then something happened and here we are today, right? So it's a very, and a lot of it dominated by a very Christian narrative of evolution, that this is about, Christianity, in a sense, saving the people of Europe to become more civilized. And that was the narrative of the church. And not a true one. It was very untrue, right? So what these guys do is they say, forget about the church. We're going back to the Greek. So the introduction of this was, there was a tremendous sort of excitement about Greek knowledge, which many of the people of the church were not necessarily, and as you may know, some of you may have read a novel by Umberto Eco that's called Name of the Rose. It's a very famous novel about medieval Europe. It was an active, long, centuries-long attempt to suppress, quite successful, to suppress Greek knowledge and Greek philosophy, which is a much more free-flowing philosophy that talks about democracy, talks about the individual, talks about virtues and self-development and different kinds of moralities from that of the Christian monks. And that's actually what liberal arts education allowed for, and complete reassessment of what is the classics, what is the classical period, and the importance of the Persians and most of it, and also of Jews, right? A reevaluation of the importance of Judaism in Western history and all that, which was also seen as anathema because anti-Semitism was very rampant at the time and so on. So in a certain sense, it's a history of a great story of success. In India, there's a similar kind of tension, of course, between certain kinds of ideology-based or religion-based narratives of history versus that of scientific history, and that's not going to go away. We have it right there in front of us right now. And I think liberal arts, worth its salt, will be and should be places where this sort of more critical inquiry into the past has to proceed. And there will be criticisms, there will be attacks on it, there will be denouncements of it, but that's part of the deal as far as I can see. That's also part of its critical importance.
Inconvenient truths, right? Or inconvenient facts, as you put it.
Inconvenient facts. There's so many inconvenient facts in Indian history. Indian history is a catalog of inconvenient facts of so many kinds. That so much is counterintuitive, and there's so much that's not yet known and written about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since he's talking about the vernacular, he's also the proud editor of the series South Asia in Motion, if you want to study more about vernacular and his work.
Yeah.
And let me end with a fun fact. He's in his 70s and he died 60.
Thank you. I won't take any offense. It's all right. I'm on the wrong side of 60, that's for sure.
As I earlier mentioned that he does his research in Mumbai, and one of his sites is Aurangabad. So Mumbai to Aurangabad is roughly 6 hours. He rides Royal Enfield for this ride, even now. So let's be more enthusiastic, not just about the work, but also about what we are interested in as academicians. And with that, let me invite Dean Vishnupad and Professor Ranjit Thapa, Dean Research, to facilitate this speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Respected VC sir, Registrar sir, deans of the schools, dear colleagues, students. On behalf of Easwari School of Liberal Arts, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to everyone who joined us today for the insightful lecture on the topic, Interiority Design, Liberal Arts Education in India. We are profoundly grateful to our esteemed speaker, Professor Thomas Blom Hansen, for shedding light on liberal arts education in India. A single conversation with a wise man is better than 10 years of study, says a Chinese proverb. Prof, your profound understanding of the subject and this discourse has truly enriched our understanding of this multidisciplinary field. We would also like to express our gratitude to our Pro-Chancellor for providing us with a platform and resources to host such enriching events that contribute to our continuous learning and growth. We extend our heartfelt thanks to our Vice Chancellor Sir and Registrar Sir for always being instrumental in creating a nurturing environment for us to learn. We are immensely thankful to Professor Vishnupad, Dean FLAP, for his contribution in organizing this exceptional event, which kindled the curiosity of students on liberal arts education. We extend our thanks to Dean of Research, Professor Ranjit Thapa, for spearheading the conduction of UDLs that serves as a space for deeper learning and intellectual discussion. Special thanks to the organizing team, our team UDL, for their relentless efforts and attention to detail as always in conducting this remarkable event. We are thankful to the Directorate of Communication, PLM team, Team ITKM, and to everyone whose involvement made this event an exceptional one. Last but not least, we would like to express our gratitude to all the attendees for your active participation and engagement. Your thoughtful questions and contributions provided immense value to this discussion, fostering a stimulating learning environment. In closing, we are truly grateful for the opportunity to come together and explore the intersection of interiority design of liberal arts education. Let us carry forth this knowledge and inspiration gained today to further our endeavors in this dynamic field. Thank you once again to everyone involved, and we look forward to future engagements that continue to foster learning and collaboration. Thank you, one and all.